Hi, my name is Steve, and in this video I am going to be going over a continuation of my overview of going about how I go about using a 3D scanner, as well as getting a little bit more specific on the Revopoint Inspire and Revoscan software. I did a video a little bit ago over some of my setup, my lighting, tabletop, different things I use to help with capturing 3D objects, and I'll put a link to that here as well as down in the description. My use case for this is really 3D assets. So I do own some 3D printers, but I'm more interested in capturing the image detail, the colors, and creating assets for use in videos, 3D animations, and those types of things. So with the Revopoint Inspire scanner, you get this little bit of a handle that's also a tripod. It does raise and lower so you can adjust the height, but this tripod is really meant for use with this turntable that comes with the scanner. You have to have smaller objects because to get at the right height to capture the entire object, you are kind of limited. So it's not a bad starting point, but I very quickly didn't use this and went on to my own option. So the first thing I did was I took a stand that is really made for my lights. When I bought this, it came with some of the lights that I've bought in the past, and I like this over a tripod because the legs are down at the bottom. I found tripods, they're much more stable, but the legs expand a long ways and they don't fit really well into small areas. I can put the scanner onto this, and this made it much easier as I started getting into larger objects. And with that, as I got into larger objects, I didn't really use the Revoscan, the Revopoint turntable. I started using my own turntable, and as I went over in my previous video, I've got this tabletop that rotates that I can get larger objects on. The other thing I did was I went out on Thingiverse, and I'll put a link to this down below. I do have a couple of 3D printers. Modified this a little bit, but somebody had created a handle in which you can put a mounting bolt in it, mount the scanner here. I added a ball joint with a phone holder, and then I can strap a battery pack down below to make this completely portable now. So now I can do it portable with my cell phone, take it with me, and this really works quite well. I was very impressed. Very nice little model, and makes it much easier for portable scanning. So that's a good option. And then the last thing I did do is I decided to try the Revopoint handheld stabilizer. So this is a gimbal, and you can control it with your hand. It wirelessly syncs to your computer. So this again gives you full wireless capabilities. You can attach a cell phone to it as well, and found this to be very helpful and a good fit for any of the Revopoint scanners. So the other thing when it comes to 3D scanning is tracking the objects. So if you have an object that has a lot of features, a lot of details, these work very well as it rotates around or by hand scanning because it has a lot of things that the scanner can track. But if you have objects that are round, cylindrical, don't really have a lot of detail, you can use a marker mat. And this came with the Inspire scanner, but when I received it, this thing was folded up into a small bag. When I unfolded it, it had a lot of creases in it and was not laying flat and was kind of a little bit of a pain to work with. So I did have a hand steamer and ran that over this. Worked quite well to get it to lay flat. So I do recommend, if you have one of those hand steamers, you're going to need it on this mat to make it lay flat and work better for you. The other thing you can do when it comes to helping the software and the scanner keep its tracking is create different objects for placing on the table or on your rotation. I've done a few different things with some 3D scanning tracking markers or objects that I can place around my table. I can put the object around that, and then as it rotates, that helps keep your tracking in place. And then in the software, you can later remove those. The one thing you want to be a little bit careful of, since I'm capturing 3D assets and images, is you want to make sure your lighting's correct to avoid shadows and a consistent shadow that's going to show up in the final scan. And one of the things I've learned over, a little over a month of using this scanner, and I would assume would apply to any 3D scanner, but it's starting to really plan out your scan. Since I'm trying to capture the actual real world look and feel of these objects so I can place them as a 3D asset, you have to look at the object you're scanning, plan out what's the best way to go about capturing that object. I have something here that's this dragon skull that's actually two pieces. So it's easiest to scan one, then scan the other. There's no need to merge these into one object because you can do that later on in your 3D editing software. Something like this skull, similar, but this comes up with kind of this rounded back that I found some of the tracking didn't always keep. So this is a nice place to use some of those tracking objects, but the underside has a lot of detail. But I did find I was able to do this in one scan, and that worked out quite well. But then when I did something like a slipper, and I was able to capture this in one scan to get the top and the bottom, but you can also do this in two models. So you don't always have to have one complete model. You can take a model, break it up into 2, 3, 4 different models, put that together in your 3D software, just parent them together. When you're doing other types of maybe use cases for these models, you want one solid model in the end, but you don't need that for 3D assets. So you could take that then into the Revoscan software, create two models, and don't even have to merge them together in your final software, just parent them together. So something to think about as you're looking at the different objects you're going to capture. What's the best way to go about that? The other suggestion I have is as you're scanning, going through the software, it's very difficult to look at a point cloud to know exactly how well the scan did. And sometimes these take a little while to completely process depending on the computer you're using. So I highly recommend just do multiple takes of the model. Even though you think, hey, I captured this, I've got everything, do 2, 3, 4 different takes because you never know when you're going to need different parts and pieces, what's going to work best. So now I want to get into the Revoscan software, how I go about it, and I'm just going to pull up the Revoscan software, talk you through my approach, my workflow, my settings, recommendations. So let's get into that. So once you get into the software, you're going to want to take a look and set up whether you want to do continuous shooting or single shot. And single shot is a new feature that they've added recently in version 5.4.1. And I'm really starting to like this for capturing assets, 3D assets and image capture. It allows you to take one photo, but still capture all of the detail, the polygons, the mesh with just one photo. So now when I used to do continuous 3D scanning, you would capture, 1,500 frames to do a model, which is great for detail, but you're also capturing 1,500 images. And then when it went to stitch all those images together, I would start getting artifacts or stitching lines, and it just sometimes worked, sometimes didn't. The nice thing with single image capture, you're now getting the same detail, but I'm probably capturing, 100 photos or 100 frames, and it really makes the workflow much easier. And I'm finding so far in my initial testing, I'm able to get better results with the texture mapping at the end of the process. I do everything at standard accuracy. I haven't done any real large scale things. I have done a little bit of marker tracking, but I try to do feature tracking. And you can select the dark object and, try some settings there depending on if you're trying to capture some black objects. And as soon as I turn on color scanning, the first thing I do is I turn off the flash. I don't like the LED flash. It works. It's not terrible, but I prefer to control my own lighting. Scanning distance, you can, define how far the scanner should be looking versus how close. So if you want to clip out objects that are in the distance, you can adjust that scanning distance to be shorter to just show your object so it doesn't pick up things in the background. For the exposure, going for image capture, I always turn off the auto exposure. I feel it's overexposed, and I tend to just adjust down a lot lower because I'm using fairly good lights, that diffuse lighting that I went over in my first video. So I can go a little bit underexposed even, and that way when you apply your lighting and your effects and your 3D software down the road, I'd rather be a little underexposed than overexposed as far as the coloring of the image, but try to match what it is in the real world. They've also added within the exposure area the ability to zoom in on an area. So you can be at 1x, 1.5x, 2x, and this can be good for getting into smaller areas of an object, maybe getting, like in this case of the slipper, maybe I want to get inside the slipper when I rotate it around, and I found that I could zoom in a little bit on an area, and that worked quite well. And then I will typically do my very first scan, my first round on auto for the exposure, and then afterwards, when I go to add some additional missing areas, things that it didn't pick up on, I will do manual and adjust it up and down to pull in what I need. Now for this, pay attention to the window, because anything that's blue is underexposed and you would need to increase the exposure. Anything that's red is going to be overexposed and you need to reduce the exposure, and you're always trying to find a balance. But remember, just because there's some blue and some red doesn't mean the scanner won't pick up. It's just in that frame, that's what's blue and red. But as you move around, as you rotate the object, you'll eventually get to those areas and pick that up. So your goal is not to get no blue, no red. You're always going to have some. And then as you're tracking along and as you're moving, whether you're doing this on a turntable by hand, if you get a red object when you select it in the viewport, that's okay. It didn't actually do anything. It's just telling you I lost the tracking, so I didn't capture anything. So that's not a bad thing. So red object displaying is okay. You don't have to cancel anything. You don't have to undo anything. It didn't actually capture an image. But as you go along, you want to take a little bit of time, and that's why I like the single shot mode, because you can take your picture, look at the window, the viewport within the software, and if it lost its tracking, if it's out of alignment, and you should be able to see that, within the window, you do have the undo and redo command to undo that, take another picture. So next up, we're going to get into processing the models now that we're done capturing all of our images in detail, and we'll move on to the next steps. So once you get your scan completed and you're starting to look at cleaning up your model and creating your mesh, you might notice that you've got some ghosting effects, some duplicate images, and this really comes from the scanner losing its tracking. And sometimes this can be a pain to clean up, but I always suggest you go through the Fusion setting, set it to the lowest 0.2 available, and you might be surprised that it automatically cleans up that point cloud. So definitely worth trying it, and that's why I suggest trying different takes, because you're just not sure what's going to get cleaned up and what's not. What do you have to manually clean up? So then I'm really just going through isolation, and the isolation tool works quite well. I will at times really raise this up to even sometimes 40 or 50%. So depending on how noisy the object is, don't hesitate to mess around with the slider and try different things. You can always go back to the original raw model and refuse it and retry again. Overlap, typically after I go through isolation, I don't have too much of that, but I always use it and apply it. And then I tend to at least do the default smoothing here within the mesh cloud, but I don't do the simplify at this point. I wait until after I do my polygon mesh before I do any simplification of the model. So when it comes to doing the mesh, I'm always going with the highest quality that I can, letting it go through. You can see down in the lower left what your vertices and polygons are. Filling holes, you've got two options here, and I will go through and do both of these depending on the surface area that you're trying to fill holes. So sometimes curved is better because it will create a curved hole to fit the surrounding area. But I've also found sometimes just doing a flat surface is better, especially for what I'm trying to capture of 3D assets, because then the image mapping, when it applies the textures, sometimes it's a little better than when it's trying to fit a basic image over a curve that it's generated when it's filling the holes. And even though it may not look as good in the model, it might look better when you texture it if you don't do the curved surface. And then I'll go through and do a little bit more smoothing here. The smoothing shouldn't really reduce a ton of polygons, but then I do start working on simplifying, because this is where you've got to get the model to a reasonable size for your 3D software that you're going to use the model in, and getting it to a manageable size to be able to, use a 3D object. You're going to have to mess around with that, and to get it to where you want to get low enough file size, but keeping enough polygons so when the texture is applied, it still looks good. And this is where in the texture, the color image is really, wrapping that around the object, whereas the vertex coloring is tending to use the number of polygons and applying it to the polygon. So the lower the polygon count, you're going to have to mess around with how much does that affect the vertex coloring versus the color image. And I suggest always doing both of these. Always do the color image, always do the vertex image, and compare the two, because you will see little areas that maybe in one show up as, an odd looking way it mapped the color, and all of a sudden in the other one it works better. But I have not found any one or the other being what you should always use. I always try both and pick the best of the two. So I hope you found this video helpful. A little bit more insight into different ways to improve your 3D scanning. Maybe you're just thinking about getting into 3D scanning. But if you're already doing this, do you have the Revopoint Inspire? Do you have a different brand or model of a 3D scanner? What are your thoughts? How do you feel they compare? Different tips and tricks you might have. Would love to hear it down in the comments. Otherwise, appreciate everybody watching this. Hope to see you in the next one.